Everyone, Suzanne here. I hope you're all well and welcome to Sew Custom. Today's video, as you will have already seen from the thumbnail, is how I sewed up this little number. So if you're interested in seeing that, then let's get started.
Starting with the fabric, this is a linen viscose blended fabric. It's quite lightweight, has a nice bit of drape to it, but it's not as dense as I want it to be. So I'm going to underline it with this, which is a cotton batiste. Has a little bit more structure to it, and these two fabrics combined should give me the structure I want for this dress. And on to the cutting out. This is my back. I have two layers of fabric underneath this pattern piece, a little notch to mark my underarm, notches to mark my dart legs, and one to mark the top of my zip. So popping a pin in at the point of that dart and marking where the pin pierces the fabric with my chalk pen. And now to draw in those dart legs, lining up my ruler with the dot and notch. So that's my back bodice notched and my dart marked. Now on to that underlining. I have two layers of that batiste fabric underneath my pattern piece. I'm marking all of the seam notches, popping a pin in for the point of my dart, and off camera I'll mark in those dart legs, which you can see here. So that's my underlining all prepped. Now to join my batiste fabric and my linen fabric together. So laying my lining fabric over my outer fabric wrong sides together, making sure all of those notches are lined up and my fabric is nice and flat. And the first thing to do here is to mark the dart. So I'm first of all going to mark it with pins. So popping a pin in at the point of the dart, making sure it's coming out through that outer fabric at that same point, and then back up through following those chalk lines. And once it's all done, this is how it looks. So now to replace those pins with some tacking stitches. So I'm using a contrasting thread, starting at the bottom of the dart leg, and I'm trying to make sure that my fabric is nice and flat as I'm doing this. Placing little running stitches the whole way up to the point and back down the other side. So now that that's done, I'm happy that my dart is in the correct position on both fabrics, and I want to do exactly the same thing around the perimeter of these pieces. So I'm just going to run that same tacking stitch the whole way around the outside. Again, trying to make sure that my fabric is nice and flat and I'm not skewing my layers at all. So I finished that off camera and this is how it looks. Everything is nice and flat, so super happy with this. So from here on I can treat these two pieces of fabric as one. So the first thing to do is to pin up that dart. So just making sure my notches at the bottom of the dart legs are lined up, popping a pin in through the top, out through the bottom and back up through again. Making sure my tacking stitches on top and bottom are nicely lined up and ready to stitch. Starting at the bottom of the dart legs, back stitching, following those tacking stitches the whole way up and pulling my threads to finish. So I've went ahead and tied off those threads, and here just removing those tacking stitches, pressing. So that's my back bodice fully prepped and ready to be added to the skirt. I have two layers of fabric underneath this pattern piece, a couple of notches to mark my dart legs, popping in a pin at the point of the dart, and I've went ahead and marked those off camera just like I did on the bodice. I've repeated that whole process again for my lining, which I've lined up with my outer fabric, making sure everything's nice and flat. I've then pinned my dart, tacked it into place along with the outer edge, and ready to stitch. Starting at the bottom of the dart leg with the back stitch, and following those tacking stitches the whole way up to the point, pulling my threads, which I'll tie off camera, remove my tacking stitches and press, and this is how it looks. So now that that's done, I'm ready to join this piece to my bodice. My fabric is right sides together, lining up my darts, lining up my edges and pinning, and ready to stitch. Back stitching to start at my 1 centimeter seam allowance the whole way across, and back stitching to finish. So I'll remove my tacking stitches and give that seam a press off camera, and this is how it looks. So for this dress I've decided to fell the seams. So to do that, I'm just trimming down all of the seam allowances underneath that top lining layer. So I'm taking away here probably about 2/3 of that allowance. So that's that done. And now wrapping that lining layer around that trim seam allowance and pressing into place. That's just going to hold all of those raw edges in underneath and nicely tucked away. And ready to stitch. Back stitching to start, using a little bit of a longer stitch length, sewing right along that crease edge and finishing with a back stitch. So that just needs a bit of a press, which you can see I've went ahead and done here. Nice and neat and tidy. And now that that's done, I'm ready to join my 2 back pieces together along that centre back seam. So in preparation for that, I've just finished off my edge on the overlocker between my top and bottom zip notch. I've done that on both sides, and here just laying one over the other, right sides together and pinning, and I'm going to stitch from that top zip notch down to the bottom one using the longest stitch length on my machine, and then below the bottom zip notch reducing my stitch length and sewing to the top of my slit. So starting at that top zip notch, stitching at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, down to the bottom zip notch, back stitching, reducing my stitch length and sewing to the top of my slit and finishing with a back stitch. So that seam just needs a bit of a press, which you can see I've done here. So where my zip will be positioned, I've pressed my seam open, and below that I've just tucked those raw edges in underneath on both sides and pressed. So now to add the zip. So I'm using a standard zip here, and I'm just laying it on top of that press seam, making sure the zipper teeth line up right in the center of that seam, and I'm going to tack this into place by hand. So tacking through all layers, using long tacking stitches just to hold the zip in position. This will make it a lot easier to sew, and more importantly, a lot easier to sew accurately. So now that that's all tacked into place, I'm ready to stitch down permanently, and while I'm there I'm going to also stitch down those felled edges below my zip using my standard zipper foot, starting at the top, back stitching, and I'm stitching about 3 or 4 millimeters away from the zipper teeth through all layers and finishing at the bottom with a back stitch. So that's that done, and of course I'll do exactly the same to the other side. So now to stitch down those felled seams at the bottom. Back stitching to start. So just like before, I'm using a little bit of a longer stitch length, stitching as close to that crease edge as I can get, and finishing with a back stitch. And again, I'll do exactly the same on the other side, and this is how it looks. So super happy with this. So now that my zip is all stitched in permanently, I'm ready to remove those machine tacking stitches I placed earlier. I'll finish that off camera, and this is how it looks. Nice and neat and tidy. So pleased with that. So one final thing I want to do just to finish the zip is to add a facing. So I've cut myself a rectangle of fabric. I'm lining it up with the seam allowance on one side and stitching here through the facing, through the seam allowance, in underneath, the whole way down. And this is just going to give a really soft finish to that centre back seam and make this dress super comfortable to wear. So that's that done. And once it's had a good press, this is how it looks. And from the outside, love this. So that's my back all fully prepped and ready to be joined to my front at the shoulder. My fabric underneath is on the fold. A couple of notches to mark my dart legs. A notch for my underarm. A notch at the top and bottom of that fold line. And just like before, popping a pin in to mark the point of those darts. I'll mark those off camera, which you can see here. I've repeated that whole process for my lining fabric, pinned my two layers together, replaced those pins with tacking stitches, and ran that same tacking stitch around the outside. Pinned up my darts and ready to stitch. Starting with the waist dart, back stitching at the dart legs, following those tacking stitches the whole way up, and pulling my threads to finish. Now for the bust dart, exactly the same thing again, back stitching at the bottom of the dart legs, following those tacking stitches the whole way up, and pulling my threads to finish. So I've tied off my threads, removed my tacking stitches, and given those darts a good press. And now this piece is ready to be joined at the waist to my skirt. My fabric underneath is on the fold. I have a notch at the centre on the waist, and then a couple of notches to mark the legs of my pleat, popping in a pin at the point of that pleat. I'll mark those off camera, which you can see here. And then off camera, I've done exactly the same thing for my lining fabric. I've joined my two pieces together, marked my pleat, and here just pinning up that pleat. So starting at the bottom, making sure those last two tacking stitches match up, making sure my notches match, and pinning. And ready to stitch. Starting with a back stitch at the notches, following those tacking stitches the whole way down, and finishing at the last one with a back stitch. So I've removed my tacking stitches and given that pleat a nice press, which you can see here. So now to secure that top edge of the pleat. So I'm just running a little bit of a longer stitch over the top within my seam allowance. And this is just going to hold that pleat in the correct position when I'm joining my skirt to the bodice, which is what I'm doing here. So my fabric is right sides together. I'm lining up my darts, my notch in the center, and my edges, pinning, and ready to stitch. Back stitching to start at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, and finishing with a back stitch. So I just need to remove my tacking stitches and finish that edge, which you can see I've went ahead and done here. So happy with that. So that's my front fully prepped and ready to be added to my back at the shoulder. My fabric is right sides together, lining up my edges and pinning, and stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching to start and to finish. So I finished off my edges, given that seam a good press, and this is how it looks. Nice and neat and tidy. And now that that's done, I'm ready to finish my armholes. And for this dress, I've decided on a bias finish. So this is just shop bought bias tape. I'm lining it up with the notch on one side, and I'm going to stitch from there the whole way over to to the notch on the other. So placing my needle right in that crease line, stitching at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching to start, and finishing with a back stitch. So I just need to trim down that seam allowance. So just like the fell seams before, I'm taking off probably about 2/3 here. So that's that done. And now pressing the bias away from the bodice, but making sure that that trimmed seam allowance in underneath is butted up against it. And ready to understitch. So I'm stitching right on the edge of that bias tape, about 1 millimeter or 2 away from the bodice fabric, using a little bit of a longer stitch length, back stitching to start and to finish. So I just need to give that a bit of a press. So this time pressing the bias towards the bodice. And ready to stitch. Using that same longer stitch length, sewing right along that inner crease edge, back stitching to start and back stitching to finish. And all of these steps are just helping to make that bias sit nice and neat and flat in underneath. So now that my bias is all attached, I'm ready to close up my side seams. Laying my back over my front, lining up my waist, my edges and my underarms, pinning and ready to stitch. Starting with a back stitch at the underarm, sewing at my 1 centimeter seam allowance the whole way down and finishing with a back stitch. So I finished my edges and given my seam a good press, and this is the result. So super happy with this. So before I can finish my hem or my slit on the back, I just need to take care of that raw edge. And on this dress, I've decided to wrap it in some bias tape. So this is the same bias tape I used on the arms, but this time I'm using my bias foot to attach it. So lining up my hem edges with the center of the bias tape, and what this foot is doing is wrapping the bias around that raw edge and running a stitch the whole way through. So that's how that looks. Nice and neat. So off camera, I've trimmed that excess bias tape and I've pressed my hem and slit. I've mitered my corners and pinned everything into place. Ready to stitch. Using a little bit of a longer stitch length, sewing right along that bias edge, pivoting at my corners, and then sewing right along the crease line I give myself on my slit. A little pivot again, and finishing with a back stitch at the top of the slit. So I just need to give that a good press, which you can see I've done here. So super happy with this. All of my edges are nicely tucked away. So now that that's done, I'm ready to close up the neckline. And for this dress, I've chosen a facing for that. So my fabric underneath my front piece is on the fold and 2 pieces underneath my back. And I want to add just a little bit of structure to the neckline. So I'm just going to press into place some cotton interfacing. This is super lightweight, but it'll give just the right amount of crispness that I want for this dress. So now to join these pieces together. So laying my front over my back, lining up my shoulders and pinning, and stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching to start and to finish. So I'll press that seam open, which you can see I've went ahead and done here. So before I can add this to the dress, I just need to finish that outer edge. So to do that, I'm going to run a stitch line from one side of the back the whole way around the front, finishing at the other side of the back. So I'm using a tiny little stitch here And this is just going to serve as a guideline for pressing in a second. So that's that done. So now I need to trim that seam allowance back. So just folding my fabric at its edge and snipping out a little triangle of that fabric. I'll repeat that the whole way around the edge, and this is what I get, ready for pressing. So I'm just folding my fabric in underneath, using that stitch line as a guide and pressing into place. And all of these steps are just helping to give me a nice smooth curve along that edge. And once it's all pressed, this is how it looks. Ready to be added to my dress. My fabric is right sides together, lining up my notches, lining up my shoulders, my centre back, pinning, and ready to stitch. Starting at the centre front with a back stitch, sewing at my 1 centimetre seam allowance, little pivot there down the centre back, and finishing at the top of the zip with a back stitch. So I've trimmed back my corners and my seam allowance and pressed, and this is the result. So super happy with this. And now the last thing I have to do is just secure that bottom edge. So using a silk thread and a super fine needle, anchoring my thread at the centre back, taking a little bit of fabric from the lining, little bit of fabric from the facing, and repeating the whole way around. And once it's all done, this is what I get. So super happy with this. And off camera, I've just added a button and a thread loop to the neckline. I've also just made myself a really quick belt, giving myself a couple of thread loops at the side seams for my belt. And with that, this little dress is complete. So I have my darts and my front bodice, my pleats in the skirt, my hem all neatly finished, and from the back I've got that facing all attached, got my button and thread loop, my zip with its facing, my bias bound armholes, darts in both the bodice and the skirt, thread loops for my belt, and then that gorgeous slit. And from the inside, everything nicely tucked away. I'm super happy with how this looks on the inside. And this is what it looks like on. So I absolutely love how this has turned out. I'm so happy I tried the underlining. It's given this outer fabric, which was a little bit too lightweight for this dress, just the right amount of structure so it hangs really nicely. It's also super comfortable. I love the whole shape of the dress. I love the length of the skirt, those pleats in the front, the belt, the gorgeous shaping around the bodice, the grown on sleeves. I will 100% be making this dress again. Love this one.
So I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you found it useful. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, please do, and I shall see you guys on Friday. Until then, I hope you have a fantastic week. Bye folks!